when I speak to a lot of TA leaders, they're being told, drive efficiency, drive productivity, do more with less.
How many people should we even be interviewing? You know, I think the problem now is like, you can't even talk to every qualified candidate for some of the roles.
How much efficiency can you actually drive at the moment?
This like inbound driven world of like, how many candidates should I be speaking to? I think some teams have lost efficiency where they're like, you know, now I can choose from 1,000 candidates, so I'm going to interview 200.
Companies giving psychometric tests and longer interview processes and interviewing more candidates and having more stages.
I think the best recruiting teams calibrate pretty early on like what does a great hire look like and can have the confidence without talking to like everyone that's in the market.
How do you think TA teams are going to be using AI and technology in the next 5 years?
At some point, everyone's using probably some advanced tool and it will be harder to get an edge. I think we'll kind of be back into it. You just have to put it into work probably.
Everyone's using the same, you're getting the same GPT message and
yeah,
you're more likely to ignore those than engage.
I think the best teams will learn how to use these tools and then still be creative and how to create an edge alongside that. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if like 2 years from now we're sitting here and recruiting is super hard again and we have all these specialized roles.
Hello and welcome to the Hiring on All Cylinders podcast. I'm Chris Abbass and today I'm joined by Benji Encz, CEO and co-founder of Ashby. And today we're talking about doing more with less. So let's get to it.
Awesome.
Hi, Benji.
Thanks for having me.
How's it going?
Good. Good to catch up as always.
Absolutely.
Good to have you out here in SF.
Yeah, we were just talking about riding self-driving cars.
Yes, definitely feels like the future. Yeah, if you haven't been in a Waymo before, highly recommend.
Absolutely. Yeah, it feels like you're absolutely in the future and where else than San Francisco.
Yeah.
So on the topic of doing more with less, we're seeing a lot of TA leaders, and when I speak to a lot of TA leaders, they're being told, drive efficiency, drive productivity, do more with less. And we're typically hearing this from TA leaders, but you're having these conversations in real time as someone who's providing tools and technology to these leaders. So I guess from a high level, how are you seeing this trend play out?
Yeah, I think there are multiple components to that, and it's kind of changed a little bit over the last 2 years or so. I'm trying to remember when this like tech downturn started happening, probably two and a half, 3 years. Early on, it was really a lot about cutting back. I mean, we came off this like massive hiring spree of like massive teams and huge amount of tools. And what we saw from our seat was really people bringing in Ashby to replace multiple tools and just reduce their kind of vendor spend and the number of vendors they were using. So that was kind of the first wave when it was really just like adjusting to this new market. I think now that teams are planning for kind of like what does this look like longer term, there's more of a focus on efficiency and kind of how do we get more out of tools? How can we do more with automation? How can we have that core team that we do have today be more productive? I think these are all kind of questions that people didn't have time to ask in like 2020, 2021. We saw a lot more like putting bodies against the problem, but now people are much more careful with that. And so I think we're going to spend more time talking about that, but really just kind of focusing on getting more done with the same headcount is a big focus.
Yeah. And is there particular areas, when people are looking to consolidate their tools that they're less interested in or more interested in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for a lot of teams that we serve, they do like the capabilities that they've acquired over the years. I think the way we came into the market was there was like this prior generation of ATSs and a little bit of this gap opened up of like how modern teams worked. And we need a dedicated CRM and we need dedicated analytics and dedicated scheduling. People really like these capabilities. I do think if you look at where the focus is, it was definitely more on analytics and more on top of funnel in 2021. And it's a little bit less there. I think the data piece is still there. But top of funnel is probably maybe most deprioritized right now because more roles can be filled with inbound today. But yeah.
And that opens up a new challenge, right? So we've gone from having to source really challenging roles, find those gems that are in roles already happy and pull them out.
Yeah.
And people created big sourcing teams. They went and bought lots of sourcing tools. But now there's this inverse problem where they have thousands of applications sometimes. How are they solving that? How are teams solving that? And how are you approaching that problem?
Yeah, I think Aaron's still learning a little bit, but we did ship a couple of things super early on around kind of limiting the volume of inbound, limiting how often people can reapply. We are seeing, actually our own team does this quite a bit, and a good amount of our customers too, leaning a little bit on historical data to get an understanding of like how many people should we even be interviewing. I think the problem now is like you can't even talk to every qualified candidate for some of the roles. And so kind of finding a reasonable upper bound of like, maybe you just need to talk to 40 people top of funnel to get like one hire out. So that's some of the things that people are optimizing for. And I think people are very curious about kind of where can we leverage AI kind of top of funnel, just like sift through massive pile of amount. I think it's something we personally were a little bit more careful about early on, but we're starting to see some signs that the latest models can probably help there. But there are tools today that help with that. I think we're seeing some adoption, but also a lot of people still testing the waters and like, being curious, but also a little bit careful because obviously it's a little bit of a touchy subject of like using machines to evaluate whether or not people are a good fit for a role.
Yeah. And that leads me on to the next point in, there's so much hype at the moment around AI automation.
Yep.
A lot of people are getting this direction of, try and halve the team and produce the same results.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Like, how much efficiency can you actually drive at the moment? Is it hype? Is it real? Like, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think we come back to the AI piece in a second, but I do think you can do quite a bit with kind of just old school automation. And where we are seeing a change is that there's more willingness to kind of learn tools, implement them really well, if there is like a gain to be had. And so for us, scheduling is like a classic one. We've actually had a lot of automation around that in the product for a while. We do see teams leaning into that much more. Before it was maybe like, oh, I don't know if a candidate wants to pick their own time or if I want to have like a more curated experience. Now people are much more willing to be like, okay, software is actually really good at scheduling. Let's have the team adopt that and lean into it. And so I think scheduling is kind of one classic area where you can get a ton of efficiency gains. And then there are other kinds of automations as well. I think we're going to talk about self-serve later, but it's kind of putting more stuff into the tool instead of like monitoring things individually is like a theme that we're seeing more of. For AI in particular, I think it's still early, and I think we're seeing that across the board. So in recruiting, we're probably even a tiny bit behind like customer support, for example. And there are a lot of teams that have tried to roll out like support functionality. It may pull back again because it didn't work as well as we expected. So I think it's a little bit too early to tell. We are exploring a number of things. I do think I don't think we're going like anywhere near full automation, but I do think there's a lot of stuff already in tools today that you can implement to actually get efficiency gains.
And so, what are you using in terms of AI? What are the features in your product?
Yeah. So again, scheduling is it's not modern generative AI, but that is an area. We actually use a lot of automation around application questions, for example. It's not AI, but it does help a ton where you can be like, have a couple of questions that people self-select and maybe auto-reject people that clearly don't fit job descriptions. This is what we put into the product. We started with things that felt very safe and things that the technology could do really well. So we started with like outbound emails. If I'm like on that, actually we do see a lift from that, and it does save. It can save like a minute or two. If I look at your LinkedIn and can draw a connection between a job description and some of your past experience and do that automatically. That's been helpful. And then another area for us has actually been maybe less around efficiency when it comes to AI specifically, and more around how do we make the product more accessible. So we've got this really powerful search where you can go back and find candidates in your database and use kind of any criteria you want. But there's a lot to learn to do that. And we make it now easy to just use natural language. And you can say like, show me, product marketers we interviewed more than 2 years ago that rejected our offers. And then you can pull up a list of these people.
That's cool.
So that's kind of one area we've been focused on. Yeah.
And you mentioned there that there was this hesitance around really leaning into coordination until people felt really comfortable that it was great.
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be a similar cycle with these new ideas that people have with AI? I've seen some examples of having avatar screening calls and things like that. And the current narrative I hear is no one wants to do that.
Yeah.
No one's going to want to speak to a robot.
Yeah.
It dehumanizes the process.
Yeah.
Is that just time? Is it just going to take some time for people to get used to this, do you think?
That's a good question. And with coordination was not only the product, the product needed to be really good, but it was also just like people need a reason to make a change, right? I think if people are comfortable and there's no pressure applied from outside, then they're just going to do what they're doing. So I feel quite skeptical about AI interviewing, but again, there's a question of necessity, and there's also the question of like, if come back to this AI resume screening piece, if we can really only interview 50 people and only look at 500 resumes in earnest, maybe there is like a way that like a machine can actually talk to much more people and get a slightly better assessment than you can get from a resume today. So yeah. I think the interesting thing, these like constraints breed creativity thing is a little bit true. I think we're going to just learn like what is kind of going to result from people needing to do more with your resources. And I think that's kind of, you're seeing some of the answer, and I'm not sure what the adoption will look like. And
do you typically think it's driven by what the candidates are willing and happy to do, or what recruitment teams are willing and happy to do? If enough recruitment teams start to use avatar screening, will the candidates eventually get on board, or do they fundamentally need to enjoy that experience for it to work?
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com.
It's probably like multi-stakeholder, there's like a little bit of wiggle room everywhere. And I think there's also a company brand. I think even back when I was an engineering director, there were already services that they weren't AI, but humans could interview engineers top of funnel and kind of take that out of the loop. And I personally, for us, it wasn't the right fit because we tried to really sell candidates in that early screen. But I think it's a question of like, what is the market for candidates? And then also, how much are you willing to put onto your employer brand? Are you like worried about that or not? I think in this market, again, I actually saw reviews for one of these tools on YouTube. I was kind of curious about it. And there were a lot of candidates commenting. It's like, hey, I've applied to hundreds of roles and I didn't get any interview. I'd much rather talk to an AI tool where I can at least express, again, what I'm capable of beyond a resume. So I think there may be some surprising outcomes of this, but I think for candidates right now, they're often just feeling like they're not getting reviewed at all because it's a little bit of a black box for them.
Yeah.
So they may actually be open to it. And it always depends on the seniority of the role as well, right? I mentioned sourcing being in decline, but there's still a ton of roles where you still need to source a lot for. So it's not.
Yeah.
It's always like a little bit of balance.
It's true. It's this seesaw of candidate market, employers market, and that probably impacts as well what you can do and how effective it's going to be.
And then some of these changes may be, introduced now, and maybe we may all end up agreeing that they're actually better. It's hard to tell.
Mm-hmm. If I'm a TA leader and I'm being told, go and increase productivity, increase efficiency, but I've got finite focus, I can only pick one thing or a couple of things that I'm going to really focus on in my team. What would you recommend? And I guess what are the most high impact areas that TA leaders can use technology to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll probably struggle. I struggle to give general short answers. Bear with me as I ramble for the next few minutes. But I think one part that stayed pretty constant throughout all of this is like data is super helpful. So, starting there and getting a sense of like where your bottlenecks actually are. And then the most common theme that we've seen are, there are a few things you can do. One is you can have fewer people and invest a little bit more in tools. So you may spend a little bit more on software, again, that can automate some stuff, and have fewer full-time people on a team. There's the ability to tap into fractional talent where possible. I think that's kind of another important trend. And then there is kind of just the service levels of what the recruiting team can do can vary. And so, it's really different to fill a role that doesn't require any sourcing support, where you're just getting a ton of inbound versus where you have to go outbound and kind of build top of funnel. And so I think we are seeing a little bit more of the self-service motion in more and more companies where for some roles, people are saying like, hey, our recruiting capacity is kind of fixed, and we're going to take the top 30 roles and we're going to support these with this level. And then after that, you're going to get this. And then after that, you're going to get this other thing. And with recruiting ops in place, I think you can actually pull it off pretty well. And it can flex the capacity of the team a little bit more by having hiring managers step into more and more parts of the process, which has historically not been true, I feel like. That's probably one of the bigger changes. So I didn't give you one thing. It's like, sorry.
You gave me some good stuff to talk about, though. And I think this is a good time to talk about the self-service because you mentioned this, and it's something that has been floated, I think, a lot over the last few years. But been hard to execute.
Yep.
So firstly, can you maybe talk about what you mean by self-service?
Yeah.
And then we can go from there.
Yeah. So I think a lot of folks that have worked with recruiting teams in larger companies are used to having a very limited role in the recruiting process. If they're a hiring manager, it's often just like calibration, maybe reviewing some resumes, but from there, stuff shows up on their calendar and everything is handled by the recruiting team. That would be like a full service model. What we are seeing is kind of across different stages of growth and different sides of companies is more companies leaning into a model where the hiring manager is more active in the process, and it could mean they're actually in the ATS moving candidates. They may schedule some of their own interviews. They may handle more of the candidate communication. And the levels of that can vary. And we see companies, it happens naturally at the super early stages, right, when you just don't have a recruiting team. But we're seeing it much later stages too. If there is like recruiting operations in place to kind of guardrail the candidate experience, because I think the biggest concern that companies have had with the model in the past is like, are candidates going to get dropped left and right? Are they going to have a really bad experience? But we see if recruiting ops kind of owns the guardrails, owns the email templates, the interview plans, has like candidate experience surveys in place to measure how this is actually working, then they tend to trust the business a little bit more to run more independently.
And so how would that work in practice? What would be the responsibility of the hiring manager and then the kind of recruiting ops function in that case?
Yeah. So it is like a full self-service model, and we actually practice that on some roles. We, partially because we want our leaders to be really deeply involved in recruiting and in the product. For us, it means recruiting operations owns all of the back-end kind of setup of a role and participates in like actually opening up the job, making sure that all the setup is in place. But then a hiring manager can run the entire process kind of end-to-end. So all scheduling, everything, including oftentimes all initial screens. Then we have some roles where we have a ton of volume and leaders are, they just can't do all of it. And then for these, sometimes we have recruiters own kind of the first screen and then hand off to the hiring manager for like the second step. And then in that case, it's like a collaboration between, the recruiter, rec ops, and the hiring manager. Yeah. And then we obviously have a full service model where the hiring manager is like much more traditionally like a little bit more in the backseat, so to speak. But just kind of that spectrum. And we see that with customers as well.
Using the kind of self-serve model there, how much of an increase in time would a hiring manager expect to spend on recruiting? Would it take up significant, more of their time, or? I
think it depends on tooling. I think the most time-consuming part is definitely this like initial screen, and so that's where we see the most trade-off for us of like, does this manager actually have enough capacity to do that or not? I won't plug our product too much, but I do think with Ashby, if you've set it up really well, the kind of candidate management piece can be something that's actually not that time consuming and can reduce a little bit of overhead of, every time I want to move a candidate, I have to ping the recruiter to do that. I think going a little bit more self-service there with the tools that we have today, I think there are other tools out there that do it well as well. That works. I think the screening part is the biggest piece.
Yeah.
And then depending how you think about, rejecting candidates and how personalized you want to be, managing that relationship can be time consuming. But top of funnel screening is probably like the biggest piece.
Yeah, I guess that's where the greater importance in having a really tight conversion at the top of that funnel to stop wasting hiring manager time.
And there's trade-offs too. You have to make sure your hiring managers are enabled really well and trained really well. Like we personally care that they give good rejection emails and people feel like there's a great process in place. So I don't think you just say like, hey, it's just a self-serve, go do your thing. You do have to have really good enablement because recruiters obviously generally much better at that part of the process. That's their expertise. So
one of the things that we really like with Ashby is the forecasting element.
Yeah.
Where when you kick off a new role, you can use historic data to show you how many interviews it's going to take, how many first seconds. And I reckon that would be really interesting to like sort the ones that would get self-service based on the higher conversions and less hiring manager time.
Yeah. And that is also, it comes again into play when you think about in this like inbound driven world of like how many candidates should I be speaking to. I think some teams have lost efficiency where they're like, now I can choose from 1,000 candidates. So I'm going to interview 200 when there's only one position to fill. So I think using data there is also really valuable to increase efficiency.
Yeah, I actually got an email from some journalist at Business Insider the other day writing an article on how there's a trend in companies giving psychometric tests and longer interview processes and interviewing more candidates and having more stages. Exactly what you're saying. Now they have this glut of candidates. They're almost being too too picky, if
Yeah.
that's even a thing, or
Yeah.
too inefficient in the
Yeah.
process. Do you
Yeah.
think that's just naturally happening because there's more candidates in the process, or why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I do think it is. I think it is a way to kind of get confidence that you are, hey, there's so much talent out in the market now that wasn't available like 5 years ago. Are we getting the best of the best? But I also think the best recruiting teams calibrate pretty early on like what does a great hire look like, and can have the confidence without talking to like everyone that's in the market. So I generally would not recommend it from an efficiency perspective, and also, again, the candidate experience still matters. In the end, someone you give an offer to may still have multiple offers, and they will probably look back and be like, was this process enjoyable or not? So I think the psychometric tests and others are maybe slightly different in nature, where people are maybe a little bit more comfortable testing for specific things that they really care about, where they were maybe worried giving like any kind of take-home assignments. So I think some of the things we're finding kind of better balance. I don't think it's bad to have people do some work during the interview process if you kind of reciprocate. But yeah.
What do you think? That's an interesting point that you just mentioned, because I think that a lot of interviewing and how you manage that process is eliminating risk and increasing confidence, right? That you're getting the right candidate. How do you think tech can do that? Is there things that tech can do to increase that confidence level?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's where we get a little bit potentially into limitation. I think there are probably some creative ideas, but a lot of it is psychology and like how do you manage kind of hiring manager expectations, and how do you use potentially, again, historical data of like, we know what great performance looks like in this role, and if we can get close to that. So I don't know if there's a silver bullet. You bring up a good question there for me to think about.
I mean, I tend to agree with the psychology point, because sometimes even if a hiring manager sees the perfect candidate, it's the first candidate they've seen. It's very rare they'd make a decision based on that because of the psychology. I want to compare. I want to. So I'd really love to get to a position where you could eliminate that.
Yes. I wonder if technology can solve that or not. I sometimes wave my hands and say, like, there's a lot we can do, but there's some things that we probably will never be able to solve because there are still humans involved. But that's a great question. I do think some things that we started doing with like post-hire, quality of hire surveys and kind of assessing what a great person looks like once they're in the job. I am excited about over time connecting that a little bit more and kind of just reminding people of like, hey, you already hired 5 people like that in the last 12 months, and here's like what great looks like. And I think reminding people of that while they're reviewing a candidate can probably help.
Yeah, there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of attention on AI at the moment and technology and driving efficiency. And it's very clear that even if it's at its infancy now, it's going to move fast. So how are you thinking about this in the future, and how do you think TA teams are going to be using AI and technology in the next 5 years? Where do you think it's going to end up?
It's a great question. It's hard to predict with things changing every couple of weeks. I do think again, we're in a phase where people are leaning more into tools, and I think when we started Ashby, people were looking at it and it's like, hey, this is awesome, but recruiters aren't very tech savvy, so are they going to actually like care about all the stuff you're putting into the product? I don't think I agreed with it that much then, but I think the moment we're going through is like making, even if that was maybe somewhat true, is making people need to be more tech savvy and lean more into tools. I think that part will probably change, maybe permanently, where a great recruiter is not just someone who's really great with candidates and has a great understanding of a hiring bar and the hiring managers and all of that, but they also are becoming really good with tools, similar to like software engineers who like get really familiar with the tools they use to become more productive. So whether it's AI or other kinds of automation, or just learning more about how to use your ATS, how to search for existing candidates, which shortcuts to use, there's so much small stuff that I feel like is becoming more important now, where people have to be more efficient, and I'd expect that will stick around. I don't really envision this like totally different future. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think people have, complained about the inefficiencies of recruiting for a really long time, but it's a fundamentally hard problem because you have this two-sided marketplace where both sides don't know if they're great or not. And that's inherently going to be inefficient forever, probably. But I think there's going to be a lot of assistance along the jobs you do many, many times every day, and kind of automating more of that, and kind of really focusing in on the things that you can't automate, which I would consider interviews part of that, but maybe I'm wrong.
And do you think it's going to be possible for, let's say, a recruiter at the moment hiring for a tech company is doing 2 placements a month, but with all of this efficiency, they can now do 4 placements a month. And they could, one person could do the job of, 2-3 people.
Yeah.
Do you think it's going to get to that point?
I think it depends a little bit again on the kind of nature of the candidate market on the other side of that. I do think if you're hiring a pretty high volume role pretty frequently where the company's pretty calibrated and there's a good supply, I do think you can do a lot more than you could in the past just by using technology. And again, I don't even think it's necessarily AI yet.
Yeah.
I think we're still waiting on some of that. But even just using kind of, again, automation and tools and kind of, you can do a lot more. I think on the other side for scarce talent, I don't think that will be true. I think even if we see, our features like this AI personalization helping now, at some point you would expect that to nullify itself out, right? If everyone's competing to hire you because you're in high demand, at some point everyone's using probably some advanced tool and will be harder to get an edge. I think we'll kind of be back into it. You just have to put it into work probably. So I think it highly depends, but I don't think we'll get to the point where you're trying to hire just like highly skilled engineer and you click a button and they just show up.
That would be great. Yeah, but yeah, I agree. Yeah. You're even seeing it with stuff like outbound sales at the moment. Everyone's using you're getting the same GPT message, and you're more likely to ignore those than engage.
I think the best teams will learn how to use these tools and then still be creative and how to create an edge alongside that. But yeah, I agree.
And what do you think of, there's people out there that think that recruiters will be fully replaced. And you'll be able to, hiring manager will be able to, like you said, push a button and they're going to have a list of candidates that they can screen and they can interview and hire. Yeah,
extremely unlikely in our lifetimes, I'd say. And the same for software engineers, right? There are people that claim software engineers will be replaced. I think the common thing typically around people making these predictions is they've not worked in that role. And it's very easy to look on the outside and be like, a software engineer is just someone who takes an idea and puts it into code. And so LLMs can generate code, so probably it's easy to replace, but there's a ton of nuance, and humans' capability to reason is still very, very different from what machines can do. I think if we ever get to a place where kind of a nuanced role like recruiting or software engineering is fully replaced, then we'll probably in this nirvana where we have infinite resources and we can all hang out on the beach. But
well, let's hope we get there faster. And do you think that the way teams are set up is going to change then? Do you think the way that they're arranged?
I do think the skills are potentially changing a bit. Again, I do think recruiting again, I'm maybe a bit biased here, but I thought recruiting operations was a really interesting trend when we started a business. And if you look at doing, generally being more efficient, using more tools, potentially bringing more self-service, that's all much better if you have a recruiting operations foundation in place because they can structure the tools to support the team. So I think that is probably a bigger trend that will continue. And then when we look at individual recruiters, I do again think like the kind of ability to work with tools to pick up new technical skills will probably be indexed on more than in the past. The outside of it, I don't know how much will change. I think we saw a little bit more specialization in the last few years. People going from like full stack recruiters to dedicated sources, dedicated RCs. Now we're seeing a little bit of that pulling back. But that is something I think is much more kind of, that just changes with the market. I wouldn't be surprised if like 2 years from now we're sitting here and recruiting is super hard again and we have all these specialized roles again.
Yeah.
But again, I think the kind of willingness and ability to work with tools and have more of an ops mindset is probably helpful.
So the big kind of takeaway is that if you're in recruiting, you really need to learn how to utilize these tools to your advantage.
I think that's usually beneficial and probably matters more now than it did a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Awesome. So to round this off, what are you and Ashby the most excited about regarding the future of recruiting and TA?
That's a good question. I do think, we were pretty fast to put out a bunch of early AI features that I think are, things like summarizing feedback, which is something that's really manual and LMs are really, really good at. And that was really exciting. I think we're slowly testing the edges of like the stuff that felt less comfortable, of like, we're not confident this is going to work, but we're going to spend some cycles on there. So I do think there is probably out of this going to come like a good amount of functionality that will make recruiting feel less tedious in the next 6 months or so, hopefully. And then also at the same time, make it easier to make the market a little bit more efficient. As I said, recruiting is generally very inefficient. A resume is a really tricky representation of someone's skills, but I'm hopeful that we can make that process just a little bit more efficient and try to get the right candidates in front of the right people over time. But there's a lot of work to do for that. But
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, where can people find you? Where can they find Ashby?
We like to hang out on LinkedIn, like all of you. So LinkedIn is a great place. AshbyHQ.com is our website. But yeah, LinkedIn is where I personally post quite a bit, and our company as well.
Awesome. And Jim puts out a lot of great content as
Yes. Yeah. We generally love to hire people that are active on LinkedIn.
well. Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Benji.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the conversation, remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Thank you.